First of all, thank you all for coming, especially those who appear at the venue, because it's like downpouring outside, and the pandemic situation is actually deteriorating over the last few days. So, welcome, to the talk, and of course all those who are online. Thank you very much for attending the talk. And first of all, of course, I'd like to thank Ian for accepting our invitation and to give his talk, the first time anywhere on Earth. Sorry. Excuse me. And first of all, let me just give you a very brief introduction of Professor Ian Buchanan. Dr. Ian Buchanan has published he is the premier figure behind, I would say, behind the whole boon of Deleuze and Guattari studies. Both the Journal of Deleuze and Guattari Studies and the conference, Deleuze and Guattari Studies Conference. I think he is the founder of both activities, which successfully promoted Deleuze and Guattari studies in the world. And the reason that scholars all over the world, many of them of the scholars all over the world are engaged in Deleuze studies is, I think, due to Ian's effort over the years, especially the journal as well as the conference has been, I think, have been around for maybe over 15 years. Jean? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, since 2008.
Okay, great. And Ian himself has published a wide variety of subjects across the range of disciplines, including literary studies, cultural studies, communication studies, and philosophy. He has published on film, literature, music, space, the internet, and war, as well as a number of other subjects. He's also the author of the Oxford Dictionary of Critical Theory and the founding editor, like I said, of the international journal Deleuze Studies. He's also the editor of 4 book series, Deleuze Connections, Critical Connections, Plateaus, and Deleuze Encounters. And he will be giving his talk on At the Mall with Fish, in which he will be talking about how we relate to fish in the aquarium and how that would help us establish a more maybe post-human kind of relationship with these marine creatures. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Ian Buchanan.
Thank you, Sebastian, for that very kind introduction, and of course, thank you for the invitation. I do wish that I was actually in Taiwan, and I'm just going to stand up a little bit so you can see my T-shirt, which I purchased in Taiwan about 5 years ago at the National Taiwan Aquarium, which is really one of the great aquariums in the world. So if anyone who is listening has not yet been there, then I do urge that you make the trip and go see it. It doesn't seem to have been very conveniently placed next to any of the sort of major cities, so it's, I gather, not a super easy place to get to. But it is a very spectacular aquarium, and certainly one from which I have learned a lot. I should also say I won't be showing any images, partly because I never like to do that anyway, but also because I'm incompetent at such things and I didn't want to further challenge myself technologically. But if you find that you wish to, and I'm sure all of you have a phone in front of you, if you Google aquariums or even Google the Taiwan's National Aquarium and select images, you will be able to see the kinds of things that I would have showed you on PowerPoint if actually I was competent enough to do so. So I'm kind of letting you do that for you. To summarize what I want to talk about, there are sort of two main points. The first is that even though there are more than 1,000 public aquariums around the world, and that visitor numbers are more or less the same as for museums, there is really no such thing yet as aquarium studies in the way that there is museum studies. And this to me is an interesting problem because it raises the question of whether or not there is any kind of discursive pressure on aquariums in the way that happens for museums, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The second point that I want to make is more of a question, but it's something like this: what do aquariums do? And when people visit aquariums, is there any possibility that the aquarium experience would somehow persuade them to be more mindful of the oceans, particularly considering that the world's oceans are in a very dire state? So that's my talk in summary, and I'll take you through the details now. If you have questions along the way, feel free to pop them in the chat function, and if they catch my eye, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'll get to them towards the end. So when it was announced that the newly reconstructed Prussian Palace in the heart of Berlin was to become the Humboldt Forum, a large exhibition space to be filled with a selection of items from the city's Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art, it sparked considerable controversy because many items in the collection are known to be or suspected of being stolen. For many, this was particularly problematic because the Humboldt brothers, after whom the museum is named, were anti-colonialists, particularly Alexander, who is honoured to this day throughout Latin America for speaking out against slavery and the mistreatment of indigenous peoples. The debate has largely turned on the issue of restitution and whether or not stolen items can and should be returned to their original owners. One well-known advisor to the Humboldt Forum, Professor Bénédicte Savoie, a specialist in the provenance of potentially stolen art, resigned in protest at what she perceived to be a policy of secrecy on the part of the collection managers, who she claimed did not want to disclose the origins of or history of items on display. The curators have since tried to turn this reticence into a virtue by arguing that the Humboldt Forum has already fulfilled an important political function in starting a debate about the provenance of museum objects, resulting in the government's promise to return, among other artifacts, the 13th century Benin bronzes to Nigeria. Now, this may well be regarded as self-serving PR, and doubtless to a certain extent it is, but what is nevertheless important to note is the fact that the public debate arose because these issues, colonialism, provenance, restitution, and so on, have been subject to academic scrutiny for decades. And as an aside to all the humanities people in the room, this is a reminder that the humanities matter. Humanities are helping to change the world. The scientists constantly tell us we don't matter, but this is a clear instance where what the work of the humanities is helping to make the world a more just place, and it's something that we should remind ourselves. So as a consequence of this work, no museum today is immune to these kinds of questions. And many museums are now, in fact, asking these questions of themselves because of the accumulated weight of the discursive formation known today as museum studies. Now, this is hardly news to anyone with a critical interest in museums, but, and as I said, this is the point I want to make, it stands in stark contrast to the reception public aquariums have received. There is no equivalent body of discourse holding aquariums accountable and, where necessary, putting their feet to the fire. Despite their popularity, particularly with school-aged children, aquariums have attracted very little interest from humanities scholars. Outside of a handful of histories of aquariums, which I will talk about shortly, there has only really been one major cultural studies monograph, Susan Davis's groundbreaking book, Spectacular Nature, which focuses on the SeaWorld in San Diego, and particularly its signature live dolphin and orca shows. Most of the existing research on aquariums is largely concentrated in the social sciences, principally in tourism and education studies. The research tends to be very visitor focused, with an emphasis on trying to quantify visitor experiences in terms of how much they learn or if their attitudes toward the ocean are altered and so on. Now, these studies are excellent, of course, but they tend to treat aquariums in a very neutral way, rarely, if ever, highlighting shortcomings in their design or offering suggestions for improving the quality of the display, and they never touch on ethical or political questions. In contrast to these works, Davis is highly critical of SeaWorld's display, and two criticisms stand out in particular for the way they situate the aquarium within the political economy of contemporary capitalism. First, she says, when she looked at SeaWorld, she saw, and I'm quoting here, a business offering a blend of information about marine animals and their environment in a commercial form that increasingly claimed the legitimacy of the traditional public educational domain. In her rather derisive assessment, SeaWorld's educational offerings are nothing more than a form of edutainment, which turns a very meagre amount of information about sea life into a commodity that visitors take home with them in the form of a checkbox, "I saw this." 2, she asks, is it not preposterous to locate a nature theme park in a social and political context that is actively dismantling environmental protections? Now, her point of reference is the US in the mid-1990s, but the global situation has really only worsened since she was speaking. And ultimately, SeaWorld is a model of how nature is thought about still by climate change denying governments and businesses. In other words, nature is separate from our world, but it exists in harmony with private enterprise, or so is the fantasy. And, you know, I can't speak for Taiwan's government, obviously, but I know that in Australia, our government talks about net zero by 2050, which is about 50 years too late to be net zero. So it's not climate denying exactly, but it is in practice. Now, if we pose the question why the field of aquarium studies hasn't emerged despite the auspicious beginnings of Davis's fantastic book, then we can say with certainty, as her book amply demonstrates, that it is not because it's not interesting. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who finds aquariums fascinating. Indeed, there is considerable scope to broaden her investigations to include a range of other sites all over the world. As I mentioned at the start, there are more than 1,000 aquariums all over the world, notably concentrated in the wealthier nations. For instance, there's only about 3 in the whole of the continent of South America. There's only about 3 in the whole of the continent of Africa, but there's literally hundreds in Europe, hundreds in North America, and there's quite a few through Asia as well. China has one of the biggest ones in the world. Japan has a very big one as well as Taiwan. Aquariums have also grown considerably in scale in the past 30 years and become substantially more technologically sophisticated. So there is good reason to continue what Davis started and explore these transformations. We can also say with certainty that it isn't because aquariums are simply too niche to be regarded as culturally significant enough to warrant further study. Visitor numbers for aquariums are more or less equal to the numbers for museums and art galleries. So how then to explain its absence? So I think there are 3 reasons why aquariums have not been given the attention or the same attention as museums and galleries. The first is that as private institutions, they do not seem to lend themselves to the Foucauldian critique focused on governmentality and policy formation that has been central to the analysis of museums. So museums tend to be state-owned, state-run institutions and are therefore easily described and analysed as instruments of the state. But aquariums, for the most part, are private institutions, and it's therefore more difficult to see them as contributing to governmentality. Secondly, classified as a subsection of theme parks, they have been, perhaps unfairly, cast into the realm of the simulacral and non-serious, about which all one can say is that they are fakes. And here one thinks of Baudrillard and Eco. And whilst I think it's fair to classify them as a form of a theme park, I don't think that means we should then not treat them as serious. And thirdly, it is, I think, symptomatic of the fact that the humanities has been very slow in giving critical attention to the ocean in general. So while there is a blue humanities, it's an extremely small area of investigation or extremely small discursive formation relative to all the other kinds of discursive formations one can find throughout humanities, which is surprising because if you think about the nature of the world, the ocean is the largest part of what our planet. Ocean going is central to all cultures and so on. So there's plenty of reasons why the ocean should be given more thought. So I want to argue that the absence of aquarium studies is unfortunate because, drawing on the excellent example of museum studies, it means that there is no critical discussion about the actual merits of aquariums or their politics or ethics. Now, this is not simply a missed scholarly opportunity. I think the stakes are higher than that. The ocean and the vast trove of life it supports, whose efforts, let's not forget, provide 70% of the oxygen that we depend on, is in a state of crisis. Indeed, it is no exaggeration to say the ocean is dying before our eyes, and the best we seem to be able to do is to congratulate ourselves on giving up plastic straws and plastic shopping bags. And as the only cultural institution focused on aquatic life, it is legitimate, I think, to wonder just what role aquariums might play in helping to shift public attitudes into a more meaningfully sustainable direction. Now, I imagine if aquariums were largely government owned, this question would have already been raised. The fact that it is privately owned and treated as a theme park means that we aren't asking this question, and I think that is very much a problem. The question this raises in turn then is what has been the cost of this scholarly neutrality, particularly from humanities scholars who ought to know better? What questions can and should be asked about aquariums that have largely been passed over in silence? How different might aquariums be today if those questions had been asked? Now, these are not questions that I propose or could answer here fully, and for me it's part of a much larger project. So I will, though, nevertheless try to offer some answers to some of those questions and begin to map out a framework as to how we might go about answering those questions. Now, I first began to visit aquariums with my children, I guess as many people do, when they were very young, usually filling in the day, as a way of filling in the day with something colourful and exciting and perhaps educational. Once my children stopped being little children, I found that I was still going to aquariums, even though I wasn't with them anymore and they were bored by them, because they intrigued me. And my fascination became an obsession over the years, and I have literally visited dozens. So the last time I was in Taiwan, I made a special point of going to the National Taiwan Aquarium. I have been, for instance, to the fish house at the London Zoo, built in 1853, to educate the citizens of the world's then most powerful nation about the reaches of its empire. This aquarium will be familiar to Harry Potter fans. It features in the first Harry Potter movie. I've also been to the equally antique Artist Zoo and its aquarium in Amsterdam, as well as aquariums in all inhabited continents, such as Monterey Bay in California, New Orleans, Toronto, Melbourne, Sydney, Hong Kong, Manila, Taiwan, as I mentioned, Tokyo, Durban, Cape Town, Rio, and Sao Paulo. At every aquarium I visited, I couldn't help but wonder about the crowds of people I shared my visit with. what did they get out of visiting aquariums? And I'm told that there are anthropologists in the room, so this is my kind of take on anthropology, or sort of anthropology of aquariums, if you like. Was it just another day out, just another way of overcoming boredom? Or was there something more to it than that? And if so, what? These questions began to take on urgency for me when I started to read more and more about the ocean. I read the work of scientists like Callum Roberts, Sylvia Earle, Carl Safina, and so on, all of whom paint a very similar picture of a vast species-rich space that is in its death throes. For centuries, the ocean has been treated as a limitless resource that can simultaneously feed hundreds of millions of people and absorb all our waste products and offer up oil and precious minerals to support our industries, all without cost or consequence to its multiple and varied ecosystems. And the more aquariums I visited, the more I wanted to know whether their exhibitions could help to change this way of seeing things. I began to wonder if the aquarium displays had what Deleuze and Guattari might call a machining quality, that is, a capacity to do something. I wanted to know if they enabled people to relate to aquatic life in what I would like to call a deep feeling way, by which I mean in a way that would make them willing to act in a more environmentally conscious and responsible way. If, as the saying goes, we only care about or care for what we know about, then the fact that most people probably only ever encounter marine creatures on ice at their local fishmonger or in batter on their dinner plates is obviously a problem from the perspective of conservation. It is evident too in the public debates about marine conservation on topics such as shark culls, no-take zones, catch sizes, and so on. But there is a deep ambivalence in the way most people think about aquatic life. We seem not to be able to empathize with marine life. Indeed, it wasn't until 2002 that it was finally accepted that fish in fact do feel pain. But even still, our approach to them continues to not reflect this knowledge, as fishing, fish farming, and aquarium practices can all attest. Even when it is recognized that marine protections are needed, we seem not to be able to divorce that thought from the idea that sea life is something either to be eaten or feared or both. Somewhat surprisingly, this outlook has been reinforced in the emerging field of blue cultural studies, which similarly tends to regard aquatic life as primarily a food resource and eating aquatic life as a viable form of relating and caring. And here I'm specifically referring to the work of Elspeth Probyn and her book, Eat the Ocean, about which I have written elsewhere, but certainly I do not agree with her on this particular issue. As I said, I do not share her view, and I've argued this elsewhere, so my concern really is to look at other pathways to relating and caring that are not premised on the consumption of aquatic creatures and could conceivably lead to a strong form of deep feeling that I believe is necessary to engender conservation thinking and acting. Hence my interest in aquariums as a kind of experiment in that direction of creating forms of care. Now, it is my sense that most people only ever encounter actual living marine creatures at an aquarium. Now, this obviously excludes snorkelers and scuba divers and so on, but they are a very small percentage of the research of the population. Various forms of research that I've looked at suggest that less than 2, maybe 3% of people go snorkeling or scuba diving. So the majority of people do not engage in this activity. But even then, even amongst the most avid snorkelers, very few of them would ever see anything like the variety of species and ecosystems that can be seen at an aquarium in the course of their entire lives. Like literally, unless you travel the whole world to go scuba diving, which again, a few people do, but it would be very much the minority, you would not see anything like the richness of species that an aquarium has to offer. As such, it seems not unreasonable to speculate that aquariums could have the potential to catalyse new forms of relating and caring. In examining aquariums from a cultural studies perspective, I want to ask several interrelated questions at once, and probably I won't answer them all, but nevertheless, I'll pose the questions. I want to know if seeing living aquatic creatures inspires feelings of attachment and care. I also want to know if these feelings differ from the feelings generated by seeing aquatic creatures on a plate. Similarly, I want to know if seeing living aquatic creatures is more or less affecting when seen in person, as opposed to seeing them on a screen in a David Attenborough or Jacques Cousteau documentary, for instance. David Attenborough's Blue Ocean 1 and 2 are amongst the most watched documentaries ever made. So clearly they are important, but I'm still interested to know whether or not there's a difference between seeing a live fish and one that's on a screen. Now, as I said, obviously enough, I can't hope to answer these questions, but I hope that they continue to resonate with you as we work through some of these issues. So using language that could have been drawn from the work of Deleuze and Guattari, but actually wasn't, Susan Davis in her book offers an answer to some of these questions in her book Spectacular Nature that I want to use as a starting point. She says the aquarium functions, and I'm quoting, as a kind of machine that structures vision in highly specific and thoughtfully determined ways. So perhaps the first way we want to think about aquariums is as a machine for structuring vision. And this is exactly the same point that has been made about art galleries and museums, that at their most basic, what these institutions do is create the circumstances by which we see and engage with the material artifacts of culture. And so we can say the same thing about the aquarium. It creates the circumstances and the conditions with which we engage with the material living fish. Aquariums, she says, are in the feelings business. They have to generate feelings of excitement and interest, and they have to avoid boredom, uneasiness, anxiety, disgust, and pity. Which is to say, nature isn't seen to be intrinsically appealing in the sense of compelling people to part with their money all by itself. It needs to be framed in a very particular way to produce that interest. So this brings me to the second point, that aquariums have to frame nature or frame aquatic life in a very particular way to make it interesting. And this is where the theme park element of aquariums very much comes into play, which makes aquariums quite different from zoos. Like zoos tend to think that the animals are intrinsically interesting, that you just want to go there and just see the lion, just see the elephant, the bear, or whatever. But aquariums are never quite so sure that people just want to see fish, so they constantly try to frame them in a very particular way. Now, this framing operates on a number of different levels in the architecture, in the lighting, in the background music, in the captioning of exhibits, the species selection, and so on. But it all serves the same basic purpose, namely to transform nature from something that one may or may not choose to look at into a compelling spectacle that you are willing to part with money to go and see. Now, I confess I do not recall the entry cost at the National Taiwan Museum, but I do know that the entry cost to the museum in Sydney is considerable. It's like $50 odd. Like, it's a really expensive thing to go and visit, more than twice the cost of a movie ticket for an adult, just to put it in perspective. So in other words, it has to be very compelling to get people to want to go there. So the aquarium is the product of both a highly selective approach to the types of creatures it puts on display and a highly inventive approach to creating new and interesting ways of displaying those creatures. So aquariums have a paradoxical aesthetic in that, as far as possible, they seem to want to solicit an experience that feels unmediated. But in order to achieve that, they need to display a fantastic range of mediating techniques. This feeling is also paradoxical in a different way, because its central goal seems to be the reaffirmation of an anthropocentric worldview. So even as we are drawn into the aquarium as though drawn into the ocean to make us think that the world is not simply about humans. The separation between ourselves and the aquatic life and the reaffirmation of ourselves as viewing subjects reaffirms an anthropocentric worldview. So documenting and deconstructing the techniques and technologies used to package nature is, I think, an important and necessary step in understanding how the aquarium machine works. And I think this is something that cultural studies does well. I've added this as a topic onto my first year cultural studies course, and one of the things I get my students to do is to visit the aquarium and to write about that experience, and it's quite illuminating because, you know, you get a big enough audience of people, they all see different things. So it's a highly recommended kind of field trip based form of education, not just for school kids, it also works for adults. So we can begin to draw the diagram of the aquarium, if you like, this is Deleuze and Guattari's concept, by reviewing its history from what I would call the perspective of desire. So in the book by Bernd Brunner called The Ocean at Home, it is clear that the aquarium, the history of the aquarium shows that it came together as the convergence of the trajectories of two different kinds of desire that were either current or reaching their peak in Europe and North America in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Firstly, the desire to collect, and secondly, the desire to display. Now, although they are obviously related, these two desires are not identical because one does not need to collect in order to display, as all forms of conspicuous consumption make apparent, nor does one need to display in order to collect, as simple hoarding would make apparent. So aquariums made visible what had hitherto been invisible, namely the depths of the ocean, and in doing so created a new world of opportunities for collecting, which the Victorian world keenly accepted. The ocean was largely unknown and unknowable until the middle of the 19th century, because the technology needed to breathe and see underwater was lacking. Now these two desires then, collecting and displaying, began to manifest themselves in a variety of ways from the late Renaissance onwards, when cabinets of curiosities became fashionable among wealthy people, more or less in step with the European exploration and conquest of the non-European parts of the world, when seagoing vessels would bring back all manner of natural wonders. Now, over the years, these cabinets of curiosity gave way to more specialist and specialized passions and interests. For instance, in the 1700s, beachcombing and shell collecting became fashionable, as did the keeping of exotic birds and ornamental poultry. From there, it was a small step to collecting and displaying live marine creatures and plants. Fish have been collected and kept in ponds and in glass-sided tanks in Europe since Roman times, and in China too since at least the 10th century. However, it wasn't until the 1700s that people began to deal seriously and effectively with the technological problems of keeping fish alive in tanks. And it took until the mid-1800s before those technical problems, principally aeration and nutrition, were sufficiently attenuated, not to say resolved, for aquariums to become vogue amongst the middle and upper classes of Europe and North America. Now, this coincided with the burgeoning of popular and essentially amateur science, and Charles Darwin is the most renowned example, which ennobled collecting as something other than the whimsical acquisition of nature's marvels. And ironically, it was one of Darwin's most vocal opponents, Philip Henry Gosse, who popularized amateur marine science and the corresponding desire to collect and display marine creatures. And he is also credited with endowing the Latin word aquarium with its current meaning. He was so successful in conveying his enthusiasm for aquariums that in later life he came to lament the devastation of England's coastal areas caused by avid collectors following in his footsteps and strip mining the seashore for specimens to stock their tanks. In the early days of collecting and keeping marine creatures, it was essentially a private passion. The collections were shown to friends, but they were not made public as such. And it was not until the mid-1800s that public aquariums began to appear. And the first public aquarium was the Fish House at London that I mentioned before, which consisted of several banks of the kinds of fish tanks one might find at home, each measuring approximately 2 or 3 meters across, with larger habitats built around the edges. For decades, this was the benchmark of what a public aquarium should look like, and it was widely emulated around the globe. For instance, Paris had its own version, and it is said to have inspired Jules Verne's 1870 novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. From its earliest days then, public aquariums have been caught in a bind which they have never been able to escape, and it has shaped their development. Namely, that they are businesses first and foremost, so they depend on numbers through their door for their existence. And in this respect, they are in the same business as theme parks, as movie theatres, as television, and the internet, what some people call the attention economy. Their commodity is nature, and its appeal, as I said, is uncertain and inconsistent. We may be fascinated by nature, or at least tell ourselves that we ought to be, but generally speaking, we do not hesitate to put our own interests ahead of that of other than human plants and animals with which we share this planet. Now, evidence of this is not hard to find, although in the case of the ocean, it typically remains unseen. Some species, such as the majestic bluefin tuna, have seen their populations dwindle by as much as 99% in the past few decades, and there are dozens more that have literally disappeared. I mean, the bluefin tuna is a particularly egregious example. Every year in the Tokyo fish markets has a story announcing that a new record has been set for the sale of a bluefin tuna, where a single fish weighing maybe 500 kilos can sell for upwards of $1 million, which is kind of extraordinary and sad all at the same time, right? Like, this is a fish that is on the verge of extinction, and so rather than banning its sale altogether, it's simply pushed the price up. Then there are the ongoing disasters of algal and jellyfish blooms, acidification, coral bleaching, the spread of deoxygenated dead zones, not to mention rising water temperatures, and the incredible volume of biological and non-biological rubbish that gets pumped into the ocean. Now, environmental devastation then is a measure not only of environmental neglect, but also of our environmental indifference, or a sort of culture of indifference. And it is precisely that indifference which aquariums try to counter, or perhaps I would say, I wish they would do more to try to counter, by pretending that they are something other than what they are, namely the continuation of that very system that has caused the catastrophic damage to the environment over the past several hundred years. So this was kind of Susan Davis's point. Aquariums are commercial enterprises. They are part and parcel of the capitalist system. It is the capitalist system that has caused the environmental devastation on a planetary scale. So the question is whether or not something that is part of that system can be also part of the solution to the problem that that system has caused. Now, this is an endless debate, and would probably boil down to something like, well, if we didn't have aquariums, then what would we have? Which is a position that I would agree with. But nevertheless, it's still important to ask the sort of political economy questions, because there is another solution, which is that aquariums should be owned and run by the state, as I assume that the National Taiwan Aquarium is, which would make it somewhat unusual. So if people know about the history of that, I would be very grateful to learn more about it. One of the acute contradictions of aquariums, as Davis points out, is that as commercial enterprises, they are both part of the system that is destroying the environment and potentially one of the voices raising the alarm about the destruction of the environment. They're one of the world's largest public aquariums, the Dubai Aquarium and Underwater Zoo, should be found in the middle of the world's largest shopping mall, in one of the world's largest shopping mall, namely the Dubai Mall, is in this respect both unsurprising and emblematic of the cultural role of aquariums today, and the attitude that most people seem to have towards fish, namely that fish are commodities that we either consume literally as food or figuratively as living spectacles. It may not be going too far to say that there is in fact no real distinction to be made between the mall and the aquarium, given that the latter is itself basically just a mall with fish, as one of Susan Davis's students pithily put it. Underwater life then is the story that keeps us shopping. Like the traditional shopping mall, which is a hybrid space that is privately owned but treated as a public space, the aquarium is a privately owned public space that we walk through, we spend time in it, we consume its images, but it remains a private space. As Davis writes, when I looked at SeaWorld as a corporately produced public space, I saw a business offering a blend of information about marine animals and their environment in a commercial form that increasingly claimed the legitimacy of traditional public education domain. So this is the third point, which I think is really important to think about with respect to aquariums, that aquariums are commercial enterprises. They're kind of basically theme parks that want people to come and gawk at fish. But to sort of legitimize themselves, they claim to be educating the public about fish. But in this way, then they turn education into a commodity. And again, this raises a very important question about the degree to which aquariums could be part of some larger project of educating people to be more caring about the ocean. So in other words, is there a kind of dialectical exclusion between the idea of education as commodity and education as affecting public change, which again is probably something that universities need to be asking themselves in this era of high university fees, which I gather is not necessarily an issue in Taiwan, but certainly is an issue in Australia. Although Davis conducted her research more than 25 years ago, her insights, I believe, continue to resonate today because the underlying logic of aquariums has not changed. And there is, I think, scope to revisit many of her key questions. One of the other points that she makes, which I think is really important, is that if we think of environmental problems as simply technical problems for which technical solutions can be found, i.e. giant booms to gather up floating plastic, or community problems for which one day community problems will be found, such as the Take 3 for the Sea campaign, and not as a direct result of capitalism as a form of life, then the best we can hope for are cosmetic changes to the way we do things, such as putting the label sustainably sourced on seafood sold at supermarkets, or this drains to the sea stencils on storm drains. And I'm sorry to say this is exactly how the aquariums I have visited frame the expected response to the multiple acknowledged threats to the future of aquatic life. And this process is known as responsibilization, whereby individual citizens are called upon to act responsibly with the help of private corporations, who are then depicted as benefactors because they donate money and expertise and so on. But essentially, the point is to make individuals responsible for saving the planet, as opposed to corporations and government who have the actual power to change things, but also in the case of corporations are definitely responsible for creating many of the problems that we're trying to solve. Now, as may be expected, satisfying the commercial imperative of the aquarium to draw in a steady stream of customers is achieved by a variety of means, such as imaginative design, cultural tie-ins, with Finding Nemo and so on, and most importantly, the lure of educational experiences, especially for young children, which is why Davis refers to it as edutainment. Now, the history of aquarium design has followed 5 main trajectories. I guess I'm probably running out of time, but I'm getting very near to the end here. So 5 main trajectories. So if we map the history of aquariums over the last 100 years or so, we can look at 5 key changes that have occurred. Firstly, aquarium tanks have gotten much larger thus enabling them to accommodate a greater variety of species in a single tank, including larger species such as the misnamed whale shark, but also in sharks like white pointers and hammerheads, and even some species such as marine mammals, such as the beluga whales, which can be seen at the Taiwan Aquarium, and also sea lions and penguins and so on. Secondly, the tanks have been shaped so as to foster the impression that one is actually inside the tank, or at least more fully immersed in the viewing experience than can be had with the flat screen. And thirdly, tanks have been created that specifically enable spectators, particularly children, to touch certain non-dangerous creatures such as sponges and starfish. Fourth, thematic framing has been added such that the newer aquariums resemble theme parks, and the most popular is the idea that you're in a sunken boat and can look through the portholes of the ocean around you, and the Taiwan Aquarium has this. And lastly, perhaps fulfilling Debord's prophecy that the image will eventually replace the thing, aquarium tanks are being replaced by flat screens displaying digital animations of aquatic life. And the Taiwan Aquarium is the most extraordinary example of this that I have seen, in that it has a whole hall that is dedicated solely to showing digital animation. So there's no live fish whatsoever in that section. So enlarging the exhibition was initially accomplished arithmetically by increasing the number of tanks. Now, though, it is accomplished geometrically by increasing the size of the tanks, which today are built on the scale of arenas. The largest tank in the world, which is in the Georgia Aquarium in Atlanta, which was built with a $250 million donation from the founder of Home Depot, features as its showpiece a 24 million litre tank, so truly enormous. The tanks in Dubai are around 10 million. There's another one in Istanbul that's of the order of 5 million. So these are enormous tanks. In the age of the world picture, Heidegger writes, everywhere and in the most varied disguises, the gigantic is making its appearance. In doing so, it evidences itself simultaneously in the tendency toward the increasingly small. And he explains this paradoxical claim as follows. The gigantic presses forward in a form that actually seems to make it disappear. In the annihilation of great distances by the airplane, in the setting before us of foreign and remote worlds in their everydayness, which is produced at random through radio by a flick of a switch. Now, both of these trajectories, the becoming gigantic and the becoming microscopic, can be observed in the history of the public aquarium, as I've just mentioned. The larger the tanks have become, and they are now gigantic, the smaller they make the ocean space they are endeavouring to present to their audiences. I am conscious of time, so I'm just going to skip through to my conclusion, and if we have other questions, I'm happy to do it. So I think, having said all that, and I have other kinds of critiques that I might pose, I guess the question that I want to conclude with is, should we not expect more of our aquariums? And if so, and I personally believe that we should, it still raises another question, which is, on what grounds do we expect more? And indeed, what would this more look like? Now, these are just some of the questions that I think an aquarium studies, which of course does not yet exist, would want to begin to think about and try to answer. It is hard not to be pessimistic about what can be achieved by aquariums as cultural institutions in terms of building support for environmentally progressive political action, but it may be that they are our best hope. And this in turn raises the question of what might be done to make them work better. How can the deadlock of commercial imperatives of the attention economy be broken in such a way that a genuinely holistic view of aquatic life can be presented, fostered, and promoted for all of our benefits? And on that, I will finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for this very illuminating talk, which I think it was, one of the very few which have dealt with the aquarium, the business or the institution of aquariums. And so, actually, I was going to tell you that, we are not really pressured by time, but, we have plenty of time for question and answer. So you can, elaborate on your points, in the Q&A session. So now the floor is open. Are there any questions from the audience at the venue? Manuel, maybe? Yeah, Manuel, please. Manuel is a colleague from our department.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really thought-provoking. Can I?
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So my question is, whenever I visit aquariums, I sort of notice a certain anthropomorphic presentation of fish and sea mammals as in the way that the panels and the drawings and the sort of framing that you talk about, there's always like a penguin or a fish or some other animal and exhibit that is talking to you, that has like a kind of like a word balloon and also works as a sort of mascot. And I feel like there's this sort of will to humanize the fish, as if the fish on display and the other animals were not close enough to us. And I wonder if this is a trend that you have observed as well, or if it's something that might be changing, maybe on the grounds of this kind of more progressive aquariums, more state-owned, less mercantilist kind of business venture. Like, what's going to happen with the humanization, anthropomorphism of fish?
Yeah, look, thank you for the question and the observation. Certainly you are completely correct, and I cannot think of a single aquarium that I have been that would contradict your observation, that they're all more or less the same. There are very powerful trends towards anthropomorphizing all the creatures in the aquarium, whether they are penguins or fish or whales or whatever. And certainly the most popular exhibits are exhibits that are drawn from films, where obviously they have been anthropomorphized even more. So, Nemo is the most overrepresented fish in any aquarium in anywhere around the world. The actual fish is about this small, and yet every aquarium has a clownfish, which is what Nemo was. So the anthropomorphism is crucial to the display. It raises a number of critical questions, and people have talked about this with respect to zoos, that the more anthropomorphized the animal is, the more likely we are to care about it, and the less likely we are to want to eat it. So it may be a good thing from the perspective of a kind of aquatic conservation, but by the same token, it also literally means that we're no longer regarding the creatures for themselves as themselves. And so in that sense, it's a kind of a deficiency in our own capacity to relate to others and kind of allow them their strangeness. So I don't think there's any easy answer or any easy way of resolving that problem, but certainly it's an important cultural observation to note that the anthropomorphism is absolutely central to how we engage with the ocean.
Yeah, Ian, can I also ask you a question? Actually, not just one question. I think I'm curious
Sure.
about the questions that you raised at the very end of your talk. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate on, you know, the question first of all, of course, are we going to demand more on the institution of aquarium, and on what grounds? And what would it be like, you know, in our kind of idealistic vision of the aquarium? Do you have some like inceptional ideas about these, you know, issues?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So I think that, I guess my grounds for saying that we should be in a position of demanding more is that really as critical humanists, we demand more of all representational forms that we encounter. And certainly, you know, the fact that museums and art galleries have been held to account for their, you know, colonial whitewashing, for their, you know, structural racism and so on. All those movements have been really important. And I think that on those grounds, we have the justification for demanding more of aquariums. What that more would look like, seems to me, is to give people a more honest and more truthful and more factual account of what the ocean really is and how it functions, and I think a kind of a better assessment of the precarity of the ocean. One of the paradoxes of aquariums is that when you go to the aquarium, you see lots of fish, and it reinforces the image of abundance, which is pretty much how most people think of the ocean, as just limitless abundance. And so therefore it sort of reinforces the idea that we don't really need to be too concerned about the ocean, because look at all these fish. So I think that there is ways by which the representation should be structured in the aquarium that make it clearer to people that the fish that we see there are in many ways endangered, that their habitats are being destroyed, and that it's human activity that is responsible for that. The problem is that as commercial entities, they're very reluctant to do that because, you know, there's no money to be made from a bad news story, as it were, particularly not when you've got kids coming. So they tend to shy away from any of the sort of harsh truths and harsh realities of the ocean. So I think that's a problem, and I think that is not easily remedied, and it's why it may be worth making the case that it needs to be government owned, and that governments should take responsibility, or certainly rich corporations. You know, they can take responsibility and use it as a way of assisting the global effort to become more sustainable and more conscious of the destruction that we are sort of carrying out on the ocean. So I've been working with a colleague who is in fact a marine biologist, and it's quite striking, like when you walk around the aquarium with a marine biologist helping you to sort of decode what you're looking at, just how much misinformation is built into aquarium displays. And I think that's a problem too. It means that what we're looking at is structured as a spectacle and not structured in a way that would help us to better understand what is going on in the ocean. So I think there's plenty of work to be done, and I think there's plenty of work that an aquarium studies could be doing.
Thank you, Ian. Any other questions from Professor Jiang from the anthropology department?
Wait.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. There are so many different levels and very interesting, and it makes me to rethink my experiences in the aquariums. So thanks very much for your talk. And I have a few questions, but it's probably not questions. It's probably some of the points that, because of the time limits, maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. And one is about the zoo. You actually mentioned about the zoo, the comparison between zoo and the aquarium, but you didn't say much about the zoo part, and you say that it's actually different. But I'm just wondering, like, in what aspect do you think that it's different from the aquarium? Because it sounds very similar in terms of as a visitors to aquarium and to the zoo. So I'm a little bit wondering what makes you think that it's actually. I know there must be differences, but to what extent? And the other thing about is you're associating this big corporate structures its influence on the way that people make the display in the aquarium. And it seems like all the aquariums in the world globally, they are more like corporate owned. It's more private owned. But this one, at least as far as I understand your talk, is the one that in Taiwan is actually state owned aquarium, or I think it's state owned, but it's another kind of system. We call it BOT kind of system, but it's still kind of state owned. So I'm just wondering, is there any difference in terms of the display in the aquarium between the so-called state owned aquarium and the business owned aquarium? And the other thing is, since all the aquarium in the world most of the aquarium in the world attributed to the so-called business model, but is there any difference in terms of the exhibition, in terms of the display inside the aquarium, or it's all basically the same? They're just trying to use different fishes, different animals inside the aquarium to attract people's attention. As you said, it's a filling business. I'm just wondering, is there a different filling business cross-cultural? Because different culture probably has different feelings towards this different the marine animals. So is there any difference that you actually can observe from your experience around the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the questions. And I see that we have a comment on the chat line here. Aquariums and zoo are different by their nature, for our distance from the marine creatures needs to be kept in order for us to observe them safely. Therefore, mediation via glass and so it is doomed that our relationship with marine creatures has to be different from that with other creatures on land. So I think that one of the obvious differences is that the marine creatures are underwater, of course, and so therefore our experience is always slightly different. And yes, it's behind glass, although zoos also have glass. I think there are two main differences between aquariums and zoos. The first is that aquariums present the ocean in a way that most people think of as being more realistic or more natural. Like when you go to the zoo, you see the gorillas in the gorilla cage, the lions in the lion cage, the elephants in the elephant cage, and you do not see a multi-species representation. But when you go to the aquarium, what you see is sometimes, and usually the centerpiece is an enormous tank in which there are multiple species all swimming around together. And so most people tend to think of that as being the most realistic representation of nature, which is a far more realistic representation than what they see at a zoo. And so that's really important. It means that people look at the aquarium and think, yes, I'm seeing nature as it really is, and this is somehow just like a window under the sea, which nobody really thinks when they go to a zoo because of the separation of species. Some of the more open plain style zoos are a little bit better at doing this, but ultimately they do tend to separate the predators from the non-predators and so on. So it's always a kind of false representation to a certain extent. Paradoxically, aquariums also make use of a number of theme park structures which you very rarely see at zoos. Okay, now some zoos have them for sure, but theme parks all have them. They all have like a theme park element to it. So very often they'll have a section that's like a kind of fake Amazon, and you feel like you're on the set of an Indiana Jones movie, and you're walking through that, and you're looking into tanks like you're pretending to be in a jungle. So there's a very strong theme park element to the aquarium, which as I said, zoos do have, but because zoos tend to be open air and outdoors, it's a very different kind of a feeling from being in an indoor setting that replicates an outdoor setting. So there is always a kind of theme of the simulacra is never very far away when you're in an aquarium. So those are the two main differences, that there is a multi-species representation which seems more real than a zoo, and then paradoxically there is a thematic framing which makes the aquarium seem less real than a zoo. The second question around state versus private, I don't actually know if the Taiwan National Aquarium is state-owned. So if somebody can Google that and find that out, that would be super helpful to me. So I can't answer that part of the question. Assuming that it is state-owned, then what I can tell you is that there is almost no difference, well, certainly none that I could see, between that and any private aquarium that I've ever been to. It has all the same elements. There was nothing distinctively government about it, which is not intended as a criticism. It's just you wouldn't know. You walk around it, it seems the same as if it was a private one. And it's worth mentioning that the largest aquarium company in the world, Sea Life Aquariums, that own like 40 odd aquariums, is owned by the same company that owns Madame Tussauds in London and Alton Towers and Legoland and that sort of thing. It's the same corporation. It's really very much in the entertainment business. And so aquariums are very much part of the entertainment business. The last question around cross-cultural differences is super interesting. And again, not one that I can easily pinpoint as to whether there are actual differences. So as I mentioned, I've been to aquariums in South America, through Asia, Europe, and so on. They are all very similar, I think in part because they are constructed as being aimed at a global audience. So like, you know, Disney in Tokyo is the same as sort of Disney in California. Like it's designed for an international audience. And as far as possible, they try to eliminate local differences that would, specifically local cultural differences that might be off-putting to an international audience. So that they are very, very similar. Certainly when I walked around the Taiwan National Museum, there was nothing about that that felt specifically local, such that I felt I don't really get this from a cultural point of view. It's very, very international in its scope. I would imagine that the details would be found, or the place to look for that would be in the details around how they describe the different species. So what I did notice is that in some countries, they, alongside the name of the species and where it's from, they tell you whether or not that species can be eaten. So all the aquariums that I went to in South America, in Rio and Sao Paulo, the main bit of information they gave you is whether or not the fish was edible or not, whether people ate it. Whereas, for example, in Australia, that you don't get that information, but you do get information about whether or not it's considered endangered or so on. So, you know, there are subtle differences, but whether or not those are cultural differences, I cannot say, but I do think that there is a very good body of work to be done about trying to better identify the cultural differences in how people relate to the exhibits that they see. And so that's where it would be great if somebody was to do an ethnography of the Taiwan Museum and say, well, this is what Taiwanese visitors are getting out of it versus this is what international visitors are getting out of it. So again, I think there's a really important body of work to be done. But thank you for the really great questions.
Well, thank you, Ian, again. Any other questions? Yeah. From
Thank you.
Question? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Chen Kanming. I'm from Hong Kong. I originally taught in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and I have a course named Animal Culture and Society. And one part of it is related to animal rights. And I just came to Taiwan since December last year. I started working for the Environmental and Animal Society of Taiwan, and that's why my background is quite related to cultural studies, animal rights, and thanks for Professor talks on the reconsideration of aquarium studies. And I really learn a lot, and I have some new vision on, like, especially talking about the design and educational purposes of aquarium. But in fact, still there are a lot of unresolvable issues relating aquarium and animal rights issues. Like I really appreciate that the ending, especially talking about we can't have more expectation on aquarium. But in fact, there are a lot of issues beside just talking about like the design of aquarium, because there are, for example, like talking about the capturing of animal, the marine animal, the process of capturing. In fact, we have no ground to expect a lot for aquarium design, but in fact, there are lot of issues relating to the background of developing or capturing marine animal for the aquarium. Like I think there are something related to the issues talking about state-owned or private-owned aquarium, because for especially talking about the private-owned one, there are a lot of contracts or subcontracting issues of recruiting people to capture the marine animal to the aquarium. There are a lot of violence, a lot of inhumane treatment to these marine animals. This is one of the issues. And another issue is that for the private owned, especially talking about the aquariums in this state, there are a lot of aquarium pairing with marine animal performances. With the performances, the training of animal is having a lot of high pressure issues, their health problem. And that's why we still have the ground to expect more of the aquarium. I'm not quite sure if there would be some quite balancing vision of moral and ethical issues relating to aquarium development. And that's why I really hope that, Professor, you can talk more on this. And one of the points you raised, which is, I think, which is very good, because for some upcoming aquarium, there are virtual design of the oceans for the attendants. That is, they make animation, they reflect the ocean with graphics rather than really building up the tank and capture the animal in the sense of redeveloping the oceans in aquarium. I think it is one of the good points that we can expect more for the aquarium design. And I really hope that, Professor, you can share more about the balancing vision on animal rights and aquarium development. Thank you.
Yeah, look, thank you. It's a hugely important question, and I do have a response to that in the actual paper itself, buried somewhere in a footnote, and I didn't really get to talk about it, but I have mentioned it elsewhere. Look, I think that the animal right question is super important and has not really been addressed, and certainly it hasn't been addressed within aquarium studies because it doesn't exist. But the historically, we know that there has been huge problems, for example, in capturing freshwater and tropical fish. That and it's not just a kind of animal rights issue; it also has been a human rights issue. So, for example, in the Philippines, a lot of the tropical fish were captured using cyanide, which was extremely dangerous both to the people using it to catch the fish and for the fish themselves, which led to a lot of tropical fish dying very quickly once you purchase them and so forth. And Hong Kong was in fact one of the world centers of the tropical fish trade. So that's hugely important. The larger question then of whether or not aquariums like zoos should have the right to display live creatures is a very difficult question. So one of the ways by which the zoo has resolved this issue is by presenting itself and literally becoming a kind of environmental conservator, in the sense that the zoos are the place where endangered species are kept alive and where they are bred in captivity and one hopes can be saved from extinction. Aquariums haven't really gone down that route just yet, partly because they continue to think that the ocean has plenitude, but nevertheless they are beginning to think that this might be one of the justifications for keeping live creatures. So whether or not how that goes, I cannot say. There are people who, marine biologists who would say that some of the tanks that fish are kept in are perfectly fine and the sea creatures are not distressed and so on. Again, it's not for me to judge, and I don't actually know the answer to that that part of it. I'll come back to the second part about animal training, because I think that's very different. But your point about animation, I think, goes hand in hand with the question about keeping live animals. And it was kind of implicit in what I was saying, which is, would seeing animations or watching movies, or even there is a couple of guys that used to work for Disney that are now making robot dolphins, and their hope is that they can make super realistic robot dolphins that will swim around in a tank, and we can go and look at those robot dolphins and kind of pretend that they're real. The question is, would they have the same affect on us? Would we feel just as inclined to want to save the ocean by watching an animation or watching a movie or watching a robot? And the answer is, I don't know. Like, I really don't know the answer to that question. And as far as I know, nobody has done any research on that question. If it was to be posed in an ethical way, and we to say, well, look, robots and animations and so forth simply don't generate the affect that live animals do, and therefore they won't have the same effect on people's inclination to save the ocean, then you would have to say, well, is it therefore then better to have live animals in an aquarium if that will encourage people to want to save the ocean? So again, I don't have an answer to that question, and I think it's something, it's another reason why we need a kind of an aquarium studies, somewhere for people to work these issues out and ask these kinds of questions. As for the animal training one, I completely agree. I tend to think that any form of, you know, dolphin training, whale training and so forth is a complete abomination, and certainly I would be very happy if they were to ban it, because there is an abundance of evidence that shows that it is really detrimental to those animals' lives. The counter argument to that is that a lot of the animals that end up in these training situations are in fact rescue animals that couldn't live in the wild on their own anymore because of they either have injuries or they've never been trained in how to kind of look after themselves, in which case then the training is one of the things that saves them from absolute boredom. So it may actually be that it's a positive for them. So again, we come back to a fairly unresolvable ethical dilemma, which is unfortunately as good as I can give in the way of an answer. Now I see on the chat line here, we got someone said, did I address Professor Wu's question as well? I'm not sure if I did.
I was asking, actually, that the professor who gave you the question. So I was asking her whether or not you addressed her question.
Oh, sorry, my mistake.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Any other questions from our audience here?
Hello. Hi, Professor. I am a first grade student of Department of Sociology in NTU, and there are two questions I would like to ask. First of all, I participated in an interview during the December. It was a national National Taiwan Aquarium. We call here 海参馆. 对, and it was a kind of like an intern, and the thing I noticed is that the reason I go there because I want to learn something about marine, about knowledge about marine animals, and then when I got it, and then when I got there, I found that it's kind of under the pressure of management of and the entrepreneurs, so there are kind of like a lack of efficiency, and it quite bothered me because what we know was that this kind of the aquarium is managed by the entrepreneurs should be more efficient, but what I saw was what I saw was not. And I was wondering that if the government had taken over the aquarium, would it be more do more research about the aquarium? And I want to know if there is some kind of is there any possible way to solve this problem? And another question is that we saw many news that the animals in the aquarium have been bullied or treated unfairly due to the people's I don't know. Yeah, they have been abused by people, but what we saw was mostly the marine mammals instead of the fishes and other species. We focused on the mammals and we didn't saw the other species like for example sharks and other fishes health. And I want to know if this is because we humans are mammals and we don't appreciate much about those species which have the far more distance from us. Yeah, that's the above two questions. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Like, super interesting questions. I'm sorry to say I probably can't give you very satisfactory answers to those questions, but I will note that your two questions kind of connect to earlier questions. So your first point about the mistreatment of animals obviously relates to the earlier point about animal rights. And again, it's not something that I have thought about, but I think, and I'm very grateful to you for the question, but I think it opens up a whole other area of research around the way by which people treat animals when they're actually at the aquarium, whether or not they are respectful towards the fish and they tap on the glass and so on and so forth. And so the trauma that the animals experience because of visitors, I think is a very important issue and very much goes to the earlier question about animal rights. The other point about whether or not the government, if the government were to take it over, would it, I guess I'm rephrasing your question, but in a way, if the government were to take it over, would it be better run? I don't know the answer to that question, but I suspect that the answer is that the fact that the government takes it over does not mean that it would therefore be better run. But I do think, or I guess I want to hope, that it's the existence of the discursive formations of academia that puts pressure on these institutions by power of its research and its inquiries and the way that it brings ethical and political arguments to the attention of the broader public. But I think that's what will lead towards better forms of aquariums, assuming, of course, that it's eventually decided that aquariums are a good thing to have, and it may well be that they are not. So I think that's the key point that I'm making, that we need a form of aquarium discourse that sort of looks into how aquariums function, how they are run, and it seems to me that that's the kind of pressure that would, you know, kind of be a counterbalance to the sort of entrepreneurial management style that you mentioned. So again, I think it opens up really terrific grounds for another line of inquiry into talking to people who work in aquariums and to better understand how these aquariums are functioned.
Thank you, Ian. There's a question in the chat room from the professor in the anthropology department, Professor Huang.
Yes, sorry. I'm just reading it now. Sorry, I'm a little bit slow.
Don't worry.
Oh, well, I guess I should read it for the people who are not able to see it. Or can everyone see it? So the question is, in the history of aquariums, there is a dialectic between collecting and displaying. And the question is, I'm curious about the entertainment part. So entertainment might result in many features of aquarium exhibit culture, and that may lead to the anthropocentric characteristics, as well as its both real and unreal representations or false representation. So the question, could we characterize the entertainment as central in the human marine creatures relation in the aquarium in addition to conservation? Yes, look, terrific question. And also, it's the point I didn't properly address in the previous question around the anthropocentric dimension. It is very clear that that is important. And almost all forms of the entertainment version of the aquarium focus on that. But just as important to the sort of anthropomorphism of the animals, if you think about the sort of theme park element, a lot of what happens with that is that it positions us as like intrepid explorers, as like Indiana Jones tramping through the jungle. And so in a way, that's not so much anthropomorphic as reinforcing the anthropocentric. And so I think that there is a strong tension as well between the tendencies that reinforce the anthropocentric worldview that come up against the anthropomorphic worldview. And it may well be that the anthropomorphic could function as a kind of counterbalance to the anthropocentric, all the ways by which we are reinforced as being the ones who look at the world. And as an anthropologist, you may well be aware of the work of Viveiros de Castro, the Brazilian anthropologist, who has written, I think, really interestingly about this dialectic between the anthropocentric and the anthropomorphic within indigenous mythologies, particularly in Brazil. But you can sort of extrapolate from there and think about the ways in which humans see the world. So he kind of talks about the fact that within Christian mythology, the world is presented as being created for humans. So the entire mythology reinforces this anthropocentric view that the creatures of the world are there for human consumption. And I think that the aquarium always runs the risk of presenting aquatic creatures as being there for our consumption, whether as entertainment or as food. So I think the entertainment factor is a really ambivalent dimension to it. If it becomes too cartoon-like, it kind of takes us away from nature. If it becomes too anthropocentric, it reinforces the view that it's not for us to care about nature. So it's hard to know. In a different paper that I wrote, kind of as I was working on this, but they have never yet quite merged them, I make an argument for and again, it's kind of Heideggerian, I make an argument for boredom. Because one of the interesting facts of a sort of digital universe is, and one of the reasons why I don't do PowerPoint, is that there is this constant drive that we must always be entertaining, and that our education must be entertaining, that when we go to an aquarium, it must be entertaining, and that we can never be bored. And yet, as Heidegger points out, it's kind of when we are at our most bored that we are receptive to transformation, because we're kind of looking for transformation. And so it seems to me that demand that we be entertained is also a demand to be distracted from never engaging with what is directly in front of us. So I think that dialectic that you have pointed out between entertainment and the relations to conservation is super important. And again, it would be a question that would be really worth thinking about how to conceptualize it. So thank you for the question, and apologies that I didn't actually answer it.
Well, thank you, Ian. Let me just pursue a little bit on the question, on the two questions from this young man who, if I correct me if I'm wrong, had worked as an intern at the National Marine Museum, National Aquarium, right? Worked there as an intern. But
just the interview.
Okay, interview. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I could speak from my own experience a little bit about these so-called cultural institutions in Taiwan. I was the director of Bureau of Cultural Affairs of Taipei City for a few years, and it was the time when, you know, the Taiwanese government was like completely swept over by this neoliberal tsunami. So the government is forcing us to, like, you know, have to transform all the cultural as many as possible, you know, the cultural institutions into PPP, you know, public-private partnership. So the National Aquarium is also one of those. And in fact, you know, I think the financial responsibilities are, for the most part, you know, on the side of the private sector. So they are probably also under a lot of pressure to make money as well. And that, but the neoliberal idea is that, you know, when you have this kind of public-private partnership, then efficiency would be, you know, would be enhanced, would be reformed, would be changed for the better. But you know, I don't really know, because, you know, yeah, maybe efficiency is better, but, you know, the financial pressure would force them into, you know, making these institutions a lot more commercialized. So they have to make money by doing so. So, you know, if it's in the hands of the government, then efficiency would be probably lower. But on the other hand, you know, when the efficiency is improved, then, you know, the content, the kind of social responsibility part of the cultural institution would be minimized. So I think it's so far it's still kind of like unsolvable kind of a dilemma. But I personally think that, you know, putting these cultural institutions in the hands of the government should be a better idea, because at least you can have a better kind of a grasp on how they actually operate, you know, whether or not they have social responsibility in their mind. But, you know, I mean,
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, please.
No, sorry. I was just saying that I agree with you. I think that in terms of when we talk about efficiency, if efficiency is financial efficiency, exactly, then to me that's the wrong measure. And so one of the questions we should be asking would be, what is the right measure? Like, what is the right way to assess and determine whether or not an aquarium is doing the job that it should be doing?
Exactly. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you, Professor Buchanan, for your inspiring talk. And I was particularly interested in the question you raised concerning whether animations like Finding Nemo or robotic dolphins would encourage us to save the ocean. And I was wondering whether the concept of the sublime or sublimity would be connected to this. Like, would people actually do something if they see something horrible? In a sense, would you say that maybe we need to kind of inject something that actually shows the harsh reality of the ocean and stuff to make people think we need to save the ocean? That's my question.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just writing it down because it's super interesting. Yeah, look, I have posed more questions that I hope to answer, and now you have posed even more questions than I can hope to answer. But I like very much your suggestion that we might need to think about this in terms of the sublime. And there has been a little bit of work done on the notion of the oceanic sublime. So you'll remember that in the Kantian definition of the sublime, that one of his images of thinking about the sublime is in fact to think of the forest, and particularly to sort of say that it overtaxes the imagination, that the forest is so so vast and so complex that we can't come up with a concept that is appropriate to it. And clearly the ocean is in the same dimension. The problem is that most accounts of the sublime tend to think of the sublime as something that paralyzes the mind because it overtaxes us, and leaves us kind of in awe of something, but doesn't necessarily leave us capable of doing something. And I think that the problem we face with the ocean is that it's both that it is overtaxing of the mind, it is overwhelming, but it also requires practical action on our part in response to sort of to save the life that is within the ocean. Like, I guess the other way of thinking about this is that the ocean is two kinds of things. On the one hand, the ocean is an enormous physical force. It's the movement of waters, it creates tides, and we think of ocean levels rising, which will inundate islands, and so on. But the ocean is also the place where the largest amount of life lives on this planet. And that life is under threat. So even if and I guess the other way to think about this is that even if every living thing in the ocean dies off, the ocean itself will still be there. And I think for most of us, it's that dichotomy that we can't really get our head around. We tend to think of the ocean as this tremendous physical force. It's constantly crashing on our shores. It's threatening to, the sea levels will rise and whole parts of the world will just disappear. It's scary to imagine being on boats crossing the ocean and all those things. So the ocean we think of as a physical force, but beneath the ocean there is then this biological life, and I think that we struggle to see those two things in their proper perspective. So I guess yes, I think that the oceanic sublime is important, but by the same token, then it's a kind of a problem if it paralyzes us. But again, you're right. Do we need to see the harsh reality of what's going on in the ocean is that going to be the trigger into action? And again, I don't know the answer to that question, but it would certainly be worth exploring in more detail and having some kind of an experiment in that direction. So we have a question here. Do we think we need to set a limit on exploring the relationship between marine animals with high intelligence? If by that you mean a kind of ethical limit in terms of performing experiments on live animals, then certainly I think the answer to that should be yes. I think that all forms of experimentation with animals should be subject to extremely rigid ethical limits. What those limits should be exactly, I'm not able to say, but definitely I think that there should be a limit.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Buchanan, for your very stimulating talk. My name is Konrad Karl. I'm from the Graduate Institute of Taiwan Literature here at NTU, and I fully agree with the conclusion that you had at the end of your talk with regards to the expectations that we can have to future aquariums. And not only do I agree, but also I see the need for this cross-institutional, interinstitutional discourse that is needed to set up maybe something like an aquarium studies or something related to that. And I mean, for the first part, we can see that obviously from within the institution of the aquarium, there's a lot that can be done. With what you've already told about the framing of that specific nature or how to design tanks, etc., etc. But the other part is what your talk is testament to, this outside institutional discourse that we need to establish. And with regards to my affiliation, I wanted to ask you if throughout your research, have you come across specific literary imaginations, literary representations and narratives about aquariums, and how you would assess the role of literature in this whole process of facilitating a kind of future aquarium, or the expectations that we have towards aquariums. I think my question is also partly maybe inspired by a recent article I read by Professor Catherine Diamond from the Tamcam Review last year about certain zoo animal narratives in literatures, because just as we already had the comparison between zoos and aquariums, and what stands out still as a kind of point that is common to both is that they are both huge attractions, but the animals or the life within them don't find too much literary representations, and the few that do find literary representations, this is the point that Professor Diamond makes in her article, help us to ascribe certain biographies and kind of move also zoo animals in that case out of a kind of marginalized kind of position of society. So I was wondering if you have, first of all, about kind of literary representation, anything that you've come across, and how you would assess the role of literature within the humanities in that, and their role in this whole process. Thank you very much.
Yeah, look, thank you for your question. So I guess one of the ways by which I came to this particular topic was out of a kind of broader interest in literary relations or accounts of the ocean, and specifically I was inspired by reading a biography of Hemingway that is called Hemingway's Boat, and I became quite interested in Hemingway as somebody who wrote extensively about the ocean, but particularly from the point of view of fishing rather than from the ocean itself. And from there I branched out and became interested in other ways by which the ocean is written about. So probably one of the most famous ones that not exactly about aquariums but touches on it would be Steinbeck's novel Cannery Row. So the central character in that novel was based on a real marine biologist by the name of Ed Ricketts, and he captured animals for aquariums, predominantly for aquariums performing scientific experiments. So that's probably the main representation within literature of an aquarium. Aquariums, as far as I know, and I haven't really found any specific examples that deal in detail with aquariums, but aquariums feature a lot in film. And so one of the other ways by which I became interested in aquariums was their filmic quality, the degree to which staring at the screen of the aquarium is quite similar to staring at the cinematic screen. And some of the bigger aquariums have auditoriums around their tank, so that when you are sitting there, you actually feel like you're in a cinema, and it's quite clear that the whole idea is to have a sort of cinematic experience. So there is this kind of blurring of the lines between live aquarium and the cinema. So I also then became quite interested in the different ways by which the screen functions. If you were to think about how cinema functions, or how aquariums function in cinema, the outliers would be things like Nemo, no, sorry, not Nemo, sorry, I meant to say Free Willy, which is about trained animals, and Flipper and so forth, which more or less treat the animals as human characters or actants in a sense. I think that's one class, but then the main way by which films deal with aquariums is to treat them as a particular kind of cinematic mood, if you like. Like in Deleuzean terms, it would be a form of an affect image, whereby what we see on the screen becomes a kind of affect image. And I think that's quite important too. But again, the point that I would make is that it uses living creatures in a way that makes us think about them as something other than living creatures. And clearly the most visible and the most obvious example of this would be the jellyfish tanks. Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a science fiction writer, he said in a talk once that he was sure that that the floating islands in the film Avatar were inspired by the jellyfish tanks at the Monterey Aquarium, and that James Cameron had seen them there and then created these islands that are like sort of floating jellyfish on his in his Avatar world. And certainly we know that James Cameron was very interested in underwater imagery, and as I gather, the sequels to Avatar are going to feature large underwater segments as well. So this kind of, I guess, is another way of answering this question, which would be to pick up on Rod Nixon's book, around slow violence, where he raises the question of whether or not the lack of representation for various forms of slow violence, such as climate change and so forth, is one of the reasons why we fail to come to grips with what's happening in climate change. I mean, it might be the case that we could say the same thing about aquariums, that the lack of representation of aquariums means that we don't really come to grips with what is going on in aquariums. Sorry, a very long answer to your question.
Thank you, Ian. Are you finished? Sorry, you finished, right? Okay. Maybe a last request from me. I was wondering whether or not you could elaborate a little bit how, as a cultural studies person, we can bring to bear on the kind of study of aquariums, the Deleuze and Guattarian theories. How can a strong Deleuze and Guattarian intervention be like? How would you, can you like elaborate on it a little bit? Because we've heard like becoming gigantic and becoming microscopic, and at the aquarium being a machine and all that. But how are we going to do that as a Deleuze or Deleuze Guattarian? Can you give us some suggestions?
Well, funny you should ask, because I actually, as part of my new book on the concept of the assemblage and its relationship to affect, I have actually been trying to answer that question for myself. And one of the ways that I've begun to think about it is to kind of look back at the concept of the assemblage and notice that there is a part of that concept which we don't really talk about and has been neglected, which is the fact that all concepts relate to a flow. And so if we think about the aquarium in terms of a flow, and I alluded to this in saying that it's part of the attention economy, but it's a flow of people through the door, it's a flow of attention, and so on. So then we begin to think, well, how does the aquarium function as an assemblage to capture this flow? And what does that capture look like? How does it work? What does it do? And what kinds of things are going on in that process of capture? And I guess it's not only what is happening in the moment that one is staring at the screen in the aquarium itself, but what happens afterwards. Why are we there to begin with? So my sense is that there's a very interesting set of questions that arise out of using Deleuze's notion of the assemblage that begins to happen once we start thinking about the assemblage in its relationship to a flow, and then think, well, what kinds of flows are flowing through the aquarium? So the flows of bodies, flows of attention, but also flows of money, and how are those flows brought into states of convergence? Would more people go to an aquarium if it was free, for example? Would more people go if they were robots, and that sort of thing? So those differentiations, I think, are really important. One of the other things that I've begun to think about with respect to this is that in the War Machine chapter, they make the very interesting point that there is a distinction between tools and weapons. And they say that weapons produce affects, they're like projectiles and so forth, and that tools are closed in and emotional. And so one question we could begin to ask is whether or not aquariums function like tools, or do they function like weapons? Do they create affects? Do they spark difference? Or do they lead towards a kind of interiorization and therefore function like tools? So I have started to work through that as a particular kind of question. So it would be a fun thing to do in a seminar with the students, to read those 8 pages of the chapter on the War Machine, and then to sort of think, well, how does this dialectic work if we apply it to a case like the aquarium? And to me, it's a pretty interesting kind of approach. So a partial answer to your question, but also a kind of watch this space, because I do think it's something that's worth trying to answer in more detail.
Thank you, Ian. I think I fully appreciate what you just said about, you know, what kind of possible interventions that we could do. I think you actually capture, by talking about capturing the flow by means of, you know, the idea of assembly, I think we could do a lot. Yeah. Are there any last questions? Maybe one more question from the audience? If there's no other questions, then, you know, I'd like to thank Professor Ian Buchanan for this very, very, not only illuminating, but very, very interesting, because, you know, this is probably one of the, probably the first time, you know, the audience here or online I was exposed to, you know, such a discourse, you know. I mean, we've all been to aquariums and all that, and I think very few people actually think about the aquarium as an institution which can actually, you know, call our attention to the imminent kind of threat of the Anthropocene. So thank you very much for calling us our attention to the role of the aquarium being, you know, an institution which could serve actually as a, maybe like all institutions, like a machine, a Deleuze machine, and you know, and hopefully, and after this talk, you know, some of us could actually try to explore the possibility of doing some kind of research on the aquarium, and then for that matter, you know, how we can have a kind of better or post-human relationship with the ocean as well as the life in it. So thank you, Ian, again, and I hope next time we meet we can actually have a drink together after academic discourses. Thank you very much.
I would like that very much.
Okay, see you very soon. I hope so. You know, hope to see you in a short time. Thank you.
Thank you.